All right. Yeah. Feel free. I'll start off right away by just saying, feel free to ask questions, raise your hands, interrupt me. I have kids, so I know what that's like. It's not really going to be a surprise to me. So we're going to talk tonight about Rails still. This is a talk that has seen many different versions over the years, but it always comes back to the same idea. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is PJ. I hail from Buffalo, New York, which is the second best town in all of New York State. Or at the very least, it's the second largest town in all of New York State. I work for a company called DevRel that I started in 2017. We do developer and community relations as a service. These are some of the great companies that I work for. These are our clients. Please check out the things that they do. You probably know Split.io. Some of you may have heard of Mattermost. You probably know Scout APM because it's a Rails app. But also check out Transposit and Vivanti. They're great companies. On the side, I also work with, as Trace mentioned, I work with open sourcing mental illness. We are working on changing the name to open sourcing mental health, which is specifically an organization that looks at mental health and tech. We do surveys, we do studies, we provide mental health and tech speakers to your events like this one. Mental Health Awareness Month is coming up. It is May. So if you have questions about mental health or you want a speaker at your event, please get in touch with me or OSMI. We're always happy to help. And also I'm obligated to say we are always accepting donations. So please feel free to get in touch. But let's talk about why we're actually here. Let's talk about Rails. But before I actually start, let me make this clear and present statement. I don't hate Rails. And the reason why I mention this is because I have done this talk before, and oddly, people are like, wow, so PJ hates Rails. No, I do not actually hate Rails. I do not have a problem with Rails, but I want to make sure that we all understand. Rails is great. It really is what you need for a large scale production application most of the time. It has history. And if you got started in Ruby working on the web, chances are Rails is what you are most familiar with, regardless of your entryway. So many developers came to Rails by default. Maybe you were a Ruby hobbyist who was looking to move to the web. Maybe you were a web developer looking for the next great language. In my case, I was working at a place that did Visual Fox Pro, and I will not ask for a show of hands on who knows Visual Fox Pro. If you know it, you know how sad a life that is. But they end of life, Microsoft said no more Visual Fox Pro. So my lead developer, he panicked. He said, I've only done this for my whole professional life. What am I going to do? Looked at Postgres. Postgres worked like Fox Pro did as far as querying. He said, cool, what works with Postgres? Oh, this Ruby on Rails thing seems cool. Can you learn in a weekend? I said, no, because that's not the way it works, but that's the classic story. That's my story. But some people, they learn to code at a boot camp. And for a lot of boot camps, Ruby on Rails is preferred because there's just this ease of use, this ease of entry. And you can pretty much install it just about anywhere. Yes, even on Windows. Rails, when it arrived on the scene, it shook up the whole open source world of web development. There was actually an alternative to Java, PHP, and Perl. And shockingly, it was actually fun to use. There was magic in the air, like Rails was amazing. And part of the allure of Rails was that magic. I remember it being said that you could build a web application Ruby on Rails, get 90% of the work done in 10% of the time. The last 10% was a real pain to crack. But it was very attractive. I could get 90% of this stuff done. Great. And this was especially good for dev shops and startups that were looking to do a fast turnover or convert a legacy system to a more modern language like we did. Rails did things auto-magically, which is practically a bad word now, but this is the way it was. You had ways to handle database connections. You didn't need to worry about writing straight SQL queries. I mean, heck, Rails came with a built-in index page just to let you know you were riding the rails. But doing things automatically kind of comes with problems. And that's something we're going to talk about tonight. Rails is huge. Huge comes with a cost. One of those costs is not being able to easily find things under the hood. So a few years ago, DHH, back when they used to allow him to keynote RailsConf, which they probably shouldn't have back then either, but that's a whole other discussion, did this talk about the Rails monolith. He was, of course, defiant and defensive. He wanted to talk about new features, but focused on why monoliths can be better than microservices or other methods of division of application labor. And of course, that's not a surprise. David is a major part of the problem. Granted, he created the solution initially, but Sometimes with an open source project, having a benevolent dictator for life can be a hindrance, and it's part of a monolithic structure. Now, before we get into politics, let me make one thing clear. As in my job as a developer advocate, as a developer evangelist, whatever you want to call it, whatever it is, this thing that I do, I get to travel to a lot of different communities, and I've never found a better community, a more accepting community, a more open community, and a more conversational community than the Ruby community. But not everyone adopts those ideas. So beyond the politics, beyond the thing that is Rails, that is David, let's talk about some of the underlying issues. Like there's other things that we need to look at. This is where we start to get into kind of the nitty gritty, looking at alternatives. Once upon a time, there were only a few alternatives to Rails. And if you wanted to put Ruby on the web, you kind of went with Rails just by default, like I said earlier. Today, the landscape is changing. It's always changing. While we've never achieved the full framework wars of other languages, and I'm looking at you, PHP, I'm looking at you a lot. And to us, that's really a blessing, not a burden, the fact that we never had to deal with that. But we've seen a growth in frameworks that do specific jobs better and in a more streamlined way in comparison to Rails. So let's take a look at that. We'll start with Sinatra. How many folks have used Sinatra or are familiar with Sinatra? You can raise your hand if you're on camera, or you can raise your hand if you're not on camera. It's all about having a good time. Oh, that's cool. It actually tells me people are raising their hands. So probably you've at least checked it out. It's usually the first thing that people go to. It's created by this dude named Blake Mizrahi back in 2007. And Sinatra has really, it was the first step towards using Ruby on the web without Rails. Since its inception, a guy named Konstantin Hasa has been the main maintainer, and he deserved a lot of the credit when it comes to making Sinatra a more recognizable name as time went on. He very much evangelized the concept of Sinatra. It's based on using routes or routes, however you want to say it, for code to be activated. Sinatra is a lightweight solution for applications that don't need the overhead that a gigantic framework like Rails provides. So what are some of the strengths? Even with the use of some of the API tools in Rails, Sinatra still has the upper hand when it comes to building an application that is ingesting something from an external API. Because of its inherent simplicity, Sinatra focuses on the task at hand with none of the overarching strain the various parts of Rails can put on an application or an infrastructure setup. So if there's no need to retain records in a DB, for example, like in a database, just read and organize the API pulled information. Why would you build a Rails application with all of the extra classes just hanging out doing nothing? Sinatra would be the best thing for what you need to do. And if there's something you need from Rails that Sinatra doesn't do, you can add it in. Sinatra is written in Ruby just as much as Rails is. It's a gem. So you can add components like active record as you need them, not get everything plus active record thrown in. To be fair, and this is going to become apparent as we move on, everything has its drawback and nothing is perfect. I'm sorry to break this to you. I'm sure some of you just want to discontinue your programming journey and call it quits because nothing is ever going to be perfect. Sorry. Sinatra and some of the other alternatives we'll talk about on this list, we need to show that they have ugly bits as well. With Sinatra, it's always been said, lightweight. For a larger scale web application, Sinatra will not be what you want. It's really for like applications dealing with very few endpoints and few, if not frequent or concurrent users. They don't want to have too many users crashing at the same time. It will crash if you put it under too much of a heavy load. That, and as it is compatible with Rails components like active record, as your application grows, you find yourself adding a little bit more. And eventually you start looking around and you realize that you've actually just revisited half of Rails and added to the project. So it sounds like this spawning need for converting into a Rails application pretty quickly. While it's not difficult, a little foresight may have been helpful in avoiding just that. So Sinatra is small. It's good for some things, just not everything. Also, I always feel the need to bring this up. When you're looking for Sinatra and his documentation, do not get fooled by something called almost Sinatra. Be it known, maintainer Konstantin Hasa is a bit of a joker, and his sense of humor leads him to attempt to do ridiculous things like write all of Sinatra in just 6 lines. Those are the 6 lines on the screen. That's all of almost Sinatra. To say it is unsafe but functional would probably be the best way to quote it. For a laugh, though, feel free to check out the repo and take a look. It's still there. People mess around with it. You'll notice, I think the key thing is in line 3, about 2/3 of the way down. You'll notice that it automatically forces a 200 OK. So you can never crash almost Sinatra. So enough about Sinatra. Let's talk about its cousin, Padrino.
There was a question, by the way, PJ, sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, sure. What is the question? Where are we looking?
Not sure how to pronounce this. At G Hamura? Yes, no? There's just a hand up.
It's Jamira.
Jamira, thank you, thank you.
I was raising my hand for something else that he mentioned earlier. I forgot to.
That's okay. Thank you for participating. Thanks, Trace, for pointing that out. Feel free to bring anything up. If I've got like 3 screens going, so if I don't see it. But Padrino. So based in Sinatra at its core, Padrino is another lightweight full stack Ruby framework. Unlike Sinatra, though, it has some features that are very Rails-like, such as methods for generating applications with a Padrino G project my app. Like, it's super easy to stand up. Think of Padrino as like Sinatra Part 2, or maybe Sinatra's younger but more robust sibling, kind of like I'm more robust than my older brother because I'm cooler and he's not. That happens sometimes. That's 100% a thing that happens, says every second sibling. So let's see what Padrino has to offer. Part of the beauty of Padrino is its tooling. It has support for a lot of different database libraries along with testing and mocking tools. It goes a step further with a drop-in admin interface that is ORM agnostic and comes with scaffolding and authentication features. This sounds great, especially for a Rails developer. It's something you're kind of familiar with, but without all that heavy overhead. So essentially, Padrino is like a step between Sinatra and Rails, and it goes a little bit beyond the simplicity of Sinatra. So something that's like a little bit more sturdy, a little bit more safe. It has a better foundation, and it allows for a more complex application to grow. You could probably get most of what you want in a Rails application out of a Padrino application. And here we run into some of the same issues we ran into with Sinatra, though. Sure, more of what we need for a more robust application, more of that's available. But if we need to implement more and more things, aren't we again just really implementing Rails? And if so, why aren't we just doing Rails? I like Padrino a lot for projects that are bigger than Sinatra, but not quite Rails ready. Like, think proof of concept applications, something that might hit production someday, but definitely is not there yet. Of course, when someday comes, that might be the time that I actually rewrite it in Rails. Or maybe I'll leave it in Padrino if I don't think there's going to be a lot of users. Note, you'll notice that there were a couple of Godfather references there. Padrino is the Spanish word for Godfather, hence why there was that imagery. I was trying to go with a theme here. That's also why the Padrino logo is kind of the tuxedo and tie of Marlon Brando from the original Godfather movie when everybody came to his daughter's wedding. But I digress. Let's focus on some other things. Cuba. So since we're on the topic of micro frameworks, let's take a look at Cuba. Cuba was one of the most easy to start with micro frameworks available to Rubyists. Written by a guy named Michel Martin, the key to Cuba, like Sinatra, is simplicity. With the avoidance of large-scale overhead, this micro framework was designed to build and deploy simple apps while avoiding bloat and unnecessary functionality. Like many micro frameworks, Cuba is rack-based. Rack minimizes the interaction between the web server supporting Ruby and the framework itself. But you probably know that. This helps improve app response times and makes using the framework, in this case Cuba, fairly simple. Fairly simple. One of the best parts about Cuba, this seems like a little bit of a departure from the other languages, is the documentation. It's a walkthrough guide available online and allows anyone to look into it and take advantage of Cuba's functionality. After working for a short time with the walkthrough guide, you'll have a simple Twitter clone called Frogger if you follow the words exactly. At this point, we should be familiar enough with Cuba to start using it for our own projects, if it's the right fit. So to the revolution now, right? Cuba, woo, go, Cuba, yay. So here's kind of the drawback. Cuba's never really been able to capture the Ruby community's attention, quite like the other options that we talked about already, and some of the ones that we'll talk about later. Certainly not like Rails or Sinatra. As such, Cuba may have some seriously outdated parts these days, making it less compatible with a modern application. Cuba also suffers from limited focus. Similar to Sinatra, the main job is to build a minimal rack application. If you're looking for something with a bit more infrastructure, a micro framework is probably not for you. So let's go on to the next one, something a bit bigger, something a bit more fleshed out. Bring out the fully fleshed frameworks. Here comes Hanami. If you think that what we talk about here sounds a lot like another framework that you may have heard of a few years ago called Lotus, you should not be surprised. Lotus became Hanami a few years ago after a certain large corporation that was big and blue and goes by a 3-letter name decided they didn't want to share the name Lotus. Hence, Hanami, created by Luca Giudi, whose name I never pronounced correctly. This is the complete era framework that has shed some of the weight of Rails for better performance. So for a long time, Luca, who I've known for quite a while, felt like Rails was just too heavy. It was too much. He literally spent his time doing his postgraduate work, his time raising a family, building Hanami to be better and stronger and something that he wanted to see in the world. This is a labor of love. In the same way that, DHH wanted to scratch an itch when he built Rails, I think that Luca may have had a slightly stronger itch, and that's why he's so focused on it. So when we talk about Hanami, what do we focus on? Speed. Hanami has the features of a fully fleshed out framework without the hard overhead that sometimes causes performance issues in Rails. Believe me, when I started with Rails in like 2007, the biggest complaint is like, wow, that's really slow. And I always hate that argument a little bit, because what we as programmers understand as slow is such a ridiculous scale when you compare it to anything else that goes on in the world. Does anyone know what the actual scale of things should be? Like, what is web speed? What number matters? Does anybody know? Type it in the chat if you know, or raise your hand. Nico, that is incorrect. Hannah, incorrect. Dimitri, incorrect. You want to know what it is? 4 seconds. 4 full American and international seconds. 4. And here's why 4 is the number. When you are running a web application or a mobile application, someone will wait 4 seconds before they refresh their page if it does not render the way that they want it to. They will wait 4 seconds and hit the refresh button. After that, they will wait 4 more seconds. If they don't hit it after that, so we're total at 8 seconds now. If they don't see what they want after that, they will go find another way to find that service. 4 seconds is a long time. This is 4 seconds right now. 4 seconds. But we're programmers, and we think just like everybody else said the thing, less than a second, 250 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds. Like, that to us is super performant. That's what Hanami wanted to focus on. It wanted to make us happy, because on the backside, we actually care about these things. But the speed comes at the cost of having a few features in Hanami not readily available that you might have seen in Rails. But as some of these features are things like CoffeeScript and action cable type things, and other things that the Rail ecosystem adds as nice to haves, but usually you don't need them, it's not as big of a drawback as it might seem. Hanami seems to have been built with the purpose of directly competing with Rails for framework dominance. That said, there's of course a few drawbacks. The pace, that's not a word. The pace of Hanami builds are kind of its biggest drawbacks. While it someday might be like a major player in the world of web frameworks, and especially Ruby frameworks, it moves along the snail's pace as far as new features and additions to the standard build. It just doesn't quite move as fast. Part of this could be easily resolved by folks like you. Get involved, submit PRs, write some code, help with documentation. This is what open source is all about. If you try Hanami and you like it and say to yourself, but it's missing whatever, build that whatever and help make it better. This will make Luca's life a lot happier. It'll make the community's life a lot happier, and we'll have more alternatives, which I think always makes things a lot better. So frameworks are interesting, but let's talk about levels of abstraction. How many people have used Trailblazer before? Trailblazer is the latest gift from a longtime Ruby punk rocker, my good friend, Nick Sutterer. The idea behind this was to help Rails to work more efficiently as a framework by enforcing encapsulation and adopting a more intuitive code structure. So a lot of the things that actually led Luca to build Hanami led Nick to build Trailblazer. Now, in the beginning, Trailblazer was just an abstraction layer that sits on top of Rails, means that it's not like truly a framework, but it's more like a framework for the Rails framework, if that makes sense. But from that time, Trailblazer has come a really long way. One of the biggest strengths of Trailblazer is its focus on moving business logic out of controllers into other pieces of code. This logic is moved to service objects known as operations. Like, a lot of that logic ends up in what Trailblazer calls operations. This makes controllers and models more lean and therefore more streamlined for use. So you're getting better performance. Additionally, Trailblazer, like Nick, is addicted to making your code more dry, like so dry. Something many Rubyists have trouble with, especially when dealing with Rails, or sometimes even Ruby in general. But Nick is a purist. He wants it to be dry as possible. So that's the focus of Trailblazer. Clean up the code, make it perform, make it do what it wants to do, what you want it to do. Unfortunately, like many things, and this is our friend Nick here, from early Rubyists, DHH kind of set a tone. He said, be opinionated. Trailblazer is very opinionated. The ideas behind it stem from other projects in Nick's repertoire, like Cells. A lot of people don't know Cells, but here's a little Ruby politics backstory for you. Nick was big into Rails. Nick loved Rails. Nick wanted to help Rails. He built a thing called Cells. Cells did a lot of that, trimming down controllers, trimming down models to make them lean kind of stuff. That was what he wanted to focus on. He went to the Rails core team and said, hey, I've got this great thing that's going to work. You could put it into Rails. And they said, no, we don't want that. And he said, but this is open source. They said, yeah, but we don't want that right now. To be fair, it was during the whole, for those of you who've been in Rails and Ruby for a while, it was during the whole MERB Rails war thing that was going on. So it was a very strange time for the Ruby community. But that said, he decided, I'll go do another thing. So Trailblazer now has a large community. There are more and more sources for learning how to apply Trailblazer to projects coming out. And as this grows, Trailblazer has the opportunity to be more widely used by larger organizations. So cool. Making Rails easier, cool. Not quite a framework, sorry. Totally broke the rules of my own talk, but there you go. It is an alternative to using Rails straight out of the box vanilla. Let's talk about Remaze. Remaze is a framework developed on the very, very simple KISS concept of programming. And I know that we're not supposed to use the full second S of KISS, but I'm going to say it anyway. Keep it simple, stupid. This is how I learned to code. This was the most important part of the things that we did when we started. The whole idea to writing code was to keep it simple so the next person could use it. So the next person could make the next iteration so you could build better. Remaze, like Sinatra or Padrino, wanted to focus on keeping things simple, building a blog and making that blog easy to use. That was the general remit of what Remaze wanted to do. It was built to work with any ORM and any database system. This put it miles ahead of some of the other frameworks that lock themselves down on either part of that. And I'm going to get to some of those later. But bringing in templating engine and adapters for your web servers, things like Unicorn and Passenger, Remaze could be a standard rack app ready to deploy after not too much setup and a little design tinkering to make it yours. So it took DHH's big idea at the beginning. So one of the things that he talked about in the beginning was with Rails, you could build a blog in 15 minutes. If you've never seen that talk, I think it was, I don't know if it was a talk or it was like a podcast. He actually does show you how to use Rails to build a blog in 15 minutes. And it's super simple, it's super straightforward. It's pretty cool. With Remaze, you could cut that down to 7. Amazing. So Remaze is really cool. It does a lot of things. It does something that all of us need to do, which is build a blog and then never update the blog. But that's another issue. We'll talk about that later. Remaze, unfortunately, though, has similar to Cuba kind of fallen by the wayside. No updates to the project since 2016. It was part of a movement for simple single page Ruby apps, but things like Middleman and Jekyll kind of took the community by storm, and Remaze wasn't able to compete. And I know that Jekyll and Middleman have both been around longer than 2016, but in the long run, sometimes that's the evolution of programming. The best must survive kind of thing, the Darwinistic nature of the things that we do, that sometimes the things that get more marketing or more dollars from a sponsor get bigger adoption. That's kind of the case with Rails. I mean, Rails came out and suddenly there was a Ruby Central that was building, conferences and stuff around this framework. And some of these other frameworks never had that opportunity. It's interesting to note here, though, that it wasn't due to an issue with the framework itself. It was kind of like picking VHS over beta formats for home video back in the 80s. Remaze just didn't have the marketing power. It wasn't that it wasn't good. It was super strong, super easy to use, but it just didn't have the people behind it. And that's okay. So let's talk a little bit about just slightly adjacent to the Ruby world. Like so many Rubyists, it would be fair if we took a look outside of our day-to-day and looked at Phoenix, the Elixir web framework created by Chris McCord, who is a former Rubyist, and he started working for Elixir and he spotted there was a huge need for a web framework. Chris was heavily influenced by Rails, and he continued to look for an MVC, a model view controller solution that would work in the new Elixir ecosystem. Not finding one, he said, I'll solve the problem myself, and now he built Phoenix, or Pohonix for those of you who prefer that kind of pronunciation. Phoenix is fast, it's scalable, makes it easy to build web interfaces and connect to backend applications. If you've used Rails, and I'm guessing from the fact that you've stayed this long in the talk that you have used Rails before, I'm thinking that you might feel right at home with Phoenix. The MVC aspect is the same. So coding things up in general works pretty much the same. The key being, as long as you are familiar with Elixir. So Elixir is a portmanteau of Ruby and Erlang. It takes kind of the functional bits of Erlang and the, dynamically typed bits of Ruby and just kind of like pushes them together into this weird peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and you get Elixir. Elixir is pretty cool, but it does have like some issues. And it's not really a weakness, but it's maybe like a fun exploration because you have to learn Elixir. That means learning functional programming, removing yourself from the concept of the object-oriented world of Ruby and changing the way you look at things. Additionally, you might even need to learn something called OTP, which is the Open Telecom Platform. That is the dated basis of what Erlang is based in, but it's something that you have to learn. It's kind of the history of the thing. Erlang is a functional language that was developed by phone companies for packet transmission. And if that sounds like something an old person says, it is because I just said it. It's pretty neat stuff to delve into, but if you're working on a project that has a timeline that doesn't allow a full language switch, Elixir and Phoenix might not be for you. I will also say this, Elixir does suffer a little bit from Rails envy, I'll call it. The idea here is that I think Elixir would have been amazing if it came out in like 2011, just after Rails had made its big jump. Why didn't it do that? Well, it just wasn't the right time. So in 2015, 2016, when we really started to gain traction, we started to see an issue with the fact that like people didn't really need another web application language. People were starting to focus on a wider range of things, and another web framework with a web application language attached to it didn't really make sense to anyone. So we focus on what we're doing. What's the right framework? And this is the sad point. This is the part everybody hates when I give these talks. There's no right answer. Your choice of a framework depends entirely on the project you are working on and the needs of your end user. It's also probably fair to say that the people who pay for you to do these things probably have a little bit of a say in what's going on. But there's so many cool things, like take everything into consideration when you're deciding which framework to use. I personally, and I'm sure you picked it up, I love Sinatra. I think Sinatra is awesome. It's like one of my favorite frameworks ever. Almost every single proof of concept thing I do in Sinatra first. It just makes sense because you're just doing this little part. It's almost like Sinatra is the next step after checking out in IRB if everything's working the way that you want it to. But explore things, find things that you like, and work with the frameworks you're comfortable with. Defaulting to Rails is always an option, and there's nothing wrong with that. But remember, it's an option, meaning there are choices out there, and it's something you should consider when you build. There was one other thing I wanted to talk about before I stopped. And so while we're looking at our framework, which is Rails and all of the other ones, we need to also look at the health of the language itself. It seems like every week or so, someone, and I'm not saying this person in particular, but someone needs to come out and talk about the death of Ruby, or share a story of being confronted about being a developer of a dead language, or to ask the question, should I learn Ruby? Is it still valuable? In the modern development world, there's no true answer, and there's no shame in the fact that no language ever dies. That said, I mean, you can still get a job doing AS400 if you want to. There are COBOL jobs out there. There are assembler jobs out there. You can find them. We have left the world of pure programming languages, though. For the most part, when we talk about working in tech, we talk about working with a lot of different things. Few, if any, applications are designed using many different languages. Or I'm sorry, few if any are designed not using many different languages. So a good example I always find is, using Ruby for the backend, PHP for the interactivity and processing, Bash for deployment automation, Vue.js for the UI, or other JavaScript all over the place because you can't do anything without JavaScript. And that's not like a super unusual recipe. That is literally Twitter. Twitter is built on those things. There's value in learning as much as possible. And Ruby has matured. There's no argument there. It is a mature, robust language. It is solid. But, and I'm making a declarative statement here, Ruby is not dead. It's never going to die. Ruby is still used by startups all over the world, as is Rails, because it, like I said in the beginning, it gets you there 90% of the way in 10% of the time. In that vein, Rails is here to stay. And there's really nothing wrong with that. It does a great job, but at the very least, we've seen there are alternatives to doing Rails just because it's the 800-kilogram gorilla in the corner. That doesn't matter to us. So go out and explore other frameworks, with the exception of almost Sinatra. Do not look at that. Maybe build the next best thing to Rails on your own. Look into things and figure out what you want to build. All of this is open source. They're your things to take, your things to make, your things to build, make better, use. Simply do these things for the sake of doing. Build things that make things better for everybody in the community. Build things that make you happy. Build things that make you inspired, and innovate on the things that you build. Rails can deliver all of this, as can any one of these frameworks. Maybe you've watched this and you're like, you know what, Ramez, it's time to give you another chance. I'm going to open up that project and see if I can help out. That's the beauty of open source. That's the beauty of how the Ruby community gives back. I started this off by saying the Ruby community is one of the best communities. It's probably the best community I've worked with. It makes me super happy every time I get to be involved with Rails or Ruby. Every time I get to build a project using the language is amazing, because I know if I need help, there's going to be somebody out there who's willing to help me. I will be at RailsConf hanging out if anybody wants to talk or chat or meet, if any of you are going. I know that's kind of weird because I just gave a talk about why you shouldn't use Rails, but that's okay. But the point here is communities build things, communities make things better. So thank you so much for your time. And that's my talk. I will take any questions you like. Thank you very much.
Awesome, man. Really enjoyed that. Really interesting. I know I've got a lot of questions, but I don't want to. I'll kick off one. What do you think? If the easiest way for people to contribute to their framework of choice, just besides get involved. Let's say you wanted to make Rails better. Let's say you wanted to do something to Rails. Should you write a gem and just publicize that, or a lot of people say pull off try to make the documentation better in Rails, or just if you want to start trying to contribute. Do you have any guidance for people who want to improve some of these frameworks?
Yeah, I've always said always start with documentation. No matter how well you think you know Rails, there's going to be parts of Rails you don't know. The documentation will get you to the point where you are able to actually deal with things and build it up. I always use as a great example Zizak. For those of you who know Zizak, he's one of the top contributors to Ruby, top contributors to Rails, top contributors to Sinatra, and his main focus is pushing documentation out. If you feel that you are strong enough, keep in mind that Ruby is written in Objective-C, I think Objective-C, and Rails is written in Ruby. If you feel strong enough in your Ruby skills, try to look at the PRs, look at the bug reports, see if there's something you can't help out with. But if you don't feel like you're at that scale, you're ready to do it, focus on building the documentation and making that better. That's always a great entry point.
Philip, Philip's got a question. I'm sorry, Jason, you have a question. Apologies, I misread the check.
I'm sorry. I was actually just clapping for PJ, but I I love Rails. I kind of also hate Rails. Can I bash Rails just a second? No, I actually wanted to respond to what you just asked, Richard, and bash Rails at the same time, which is to point out one interesting thing to do is, as a Rails developer, is to go to the Rails GitHub today and see the number of current issues that are open on Rails thing. So it's a lot. That's all I'm going to say, right? Like, there's a lot, and it's like when you go to the Rails GitHub, to me, I feel overwhelmed. Like, I know what you're saying. It feels like
it can be very overwhelming. Yeah.
And so but I see all these issues and I'm like, well, should I just start helping people? Because maybe I can help them with these issues. So to me, Rails is very, very big in that regard. And there's a group of people that you got to get in sync with.
So yeah,
it's not just the largeness of the project either. It's the largest of the largeness of the community of developers that are working on Rails. So like there's two sides to like Rails itself is huge and has a huge repo that is zillions of issues, but also there's the number of people that you need to be involved with to get involved as well, to communicate with.
I would, I confess I have not been an open source contributor on any project. It's something I want to change, but I'm sure part of it must be like building confidence or just building those relationships like you would in any, with anything, people getting to know you and stuff
Absolutely.
like that. I'm not really, I would say I'm a naive person when it comes to some of the things in the Rails community. I don't really understand a lot of the controversies that, occupy social media, but that said, we have a question from Nico. Please take it.
Oh, I'm going to throw in my 2 cents, but I do have a question as well. I think sometimes you shouldn't hunt for the largest fish to contribute to, right?
Go for that low hanging fruit.
Exactly. So like you look at, we have GitHub and we have Shopify, and they employ, they employ core team members, right? But they didn't start out as core team members, but they contributed so much to what everybody wanted to use that Rails has to accept. So it's like being the next biggest gorilla in the room allows you to say what you want to do. But if not, like, an example from our team, stimulus reflex is something that we use, and it's pretty awesome. It's a fun tool that's out there. But a tiny logger error was something that popped up in our system, which ended up throwing out 250,000 errors in like 3 days. It's a one-line fix, a one-line PR, pushed in and merged in a day. So sometimes it just takes finding the low-hanging fruit there and not trying to battle the gorilla, because you can really push forward the ideas from the outsides, and those will get accepted eventually into core mainstream for Rubyist or Ruby on Rails, which leads to my question about Hanami. Is I really like what they're doing over there, and you mentioned that with Elixir, one of the weaknesses maybe that you have to pick up functional programming paradigms. I kind of thought Hanami and Trailblazer also had some of that, but this is me just starting to learn them and get into them and loving DryRB, DryRB and what they're doing. So is that the same case for that jump in paradigm switch?
I think that with Hanami and Trailblazer, it's kind of like they're anecdotally related to functional programming. Like they're kind of like they're giving the nod, if you will.
Yep.
With Erlang and Elixir, it's not a nod. This is functional programming.
Got you.
So maybe because you've explored Hanami and Trailblazer, you can kind of jump over and look at Elixir a little bit more easily because you kind of understand the concepts there.
Right.
It does take a little bit of context switching, but it's not impossible.
Yeah.
It's not like, I don't want to paint the picture like, oh, you really have to pick this up and maybe go take a college course. Like, no, it's going to take you a couple of weeks to get used to the way that things are done.
Yeah. Okay.
And I do see there's a couple of questions in the comments. The first one I'd like to address is Dimitri. No, so the beard does not reflect my preference for Cuba. This is just my winter beard. I live in Buffalo, New York. It gets cold.
You
need to keep
look,
your neck warm.
when you had that slide, when you had that Cuba, here some not so great things about that slide, and you had your face was just perfectly the same. I was like, wait a second.
That was completely unintentional, but now I'm really looking forward to looking at this recording. But yeah. No, it's just cold in Buffalo. I'm really glad I didn't wear. I have like a hat that kind of looks like the Fidel Castro like military hat. Really glad I did not wear that. That would have been messed up. Another question: why do you think Phoenix and Elixir did not become even more popular? Thanks for the question, Andre. Timing. The real answer here is timing. They came along at a time when you had Ruby on Rails and it was like fully fleshed and very popular and had very heavily used. PHP at the time had Laravel and Drupal and Symfony and all of these huge frameworks that it was using. And PHP is 80% of the internet. The argument doesn't matter. They've won that part. They had all these great things that you could do. The last thing we really needed was another like, hey, here's another MVC framework for you to play with. And it's like, yeah, I could go learn that, but like, why? Like, nobody's going to give me a job doing that. And we've seen like throughout the years, because it basically does the same thing of Ruby as Ruby on Rails, where you can hire hundreds of people at the drop of a hat, more or less. I'm being very hyperbolic here, but you can hire people easily for Ruby on Rails job. Whereas for Elixir Phoenix, like you're kind of going to be dealing with finding the right people and possibly retraining. So why not go with the solid thing that you already have, which is Ruby, Rails, PHP, all its frameworks, and you can easily find people to fill the need. It was just timing. If it, like I said, if it had come out 5 years earlier, totally would have been a huge competitor in the market.
I'm going to slip another question in. What do you think about some of the cool stuff that's happening and with concurrency and Rails? Like I started playing around with Ractor, or however it's properly pronounced, which just looks so cool. And I ended up causing it to fall over. But I mean, the promise of stuff like that seems to really, address some of the longstanding concerns about, performance and stuff in Ruby and possibly Rails. If those things get adopted already, I think in 7, there are, concurrency features for active record that you can invoke. I think there's specific methods that you can basically call out to make concurrency part of your active record updates.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that it's interesting to see these things that are built in, because I mean, for a long time, if you wanted to have things like concurrency and multi-threading, you could easily have done that by switching the focus from Ruby to JRuby, or even using Mira as a somewhat much more nascent project. But like if you were willing to switch to JRuby, you could get a lot of those features, and now they're just figuring those out for Ruby and Rails, like how to get what they're looking for. I also think that a lot of it was, there's a lot of backlog there. Like we talked about how many issues they have open, but it's great to me to see that these issues are like finally being resolved. There's so many great things that are coming out in the ecosystem that it's like, it's not so much as difficult to keep track of. It's a little difficult to keep track of, but it's like really enjoyable as, every single domino for things that people would knock Ruby for or knock Rails for are now becoming like, hey, sorry, that's built in. That's not an issue for us anymore. Hey, we have, you don't like the performance. Well, we've got better performance now. Like Ruby is a competitive language in the world now. Whereas it, when I started with it, it was considered like, I remember going to a meetup and I was like, hey, I work at a place where we do Ruby on Rails. And they're like, what can you make with Ruby on Rails? And I was like, the largest academic software in the world. I don't know. Twitter, but people looked at it as a joke and they never really understood that Rails could scale. And now like Rails clearly can scale. Ruby can definitely scale. Yeah, Trace, exactly. Netflix, like these things are all built, and now everybody and their mother uses Shopify and they're like, but Rails doesn't scale. Are you serious? This isn't 2007. Grow up. But like as you were saying, Richard, like there's so many great pieces that are coming out. Like it's almost difficult to get a chance to play with all of them, but I recommend that everybody takes a little time every time a new announcement comes out about a new feature. Like at least take a look at the documentation, read through it, see if it's something that you could piece in and continue to grow that kind of application infrastructure.
You mentioned JRuby. Just a quick throw-in question. Are you aware of like any big projects that actually use JRuby, or which projects use JRuby? Because that seems like, that provides a lot of synergistic sort of opportunity to get, to combine libraries in the Java world that, is a very popular ecosystem for a lot of big firms. Yeah.
I don't specifically know. I know there's a bunch at Red Hat because that's where Charlie works. Charlie Nutter, who is the guy who created JRuby, works directly for Red Hat. So a lot of the projects that he's involved with there, he adopts JRuby and kind of does, says, hey, look, this is working well. Let's continue to use JRuby for it. I don't have any specific names, but I guarantee that if you tweet out to him, and his Twitter is @Headius, @HEADIUS, and say, tell me about a great JRuby project, he could probably list off 1,000 off the top of his head.
If you wouldn't mind like messaging that, I would appreciate his handle.
Sure.
That'd be awesome. Who else has a question for PJ?
Well, there's one in the questions in the chat here. How active is the Sinatra project these days? I would say it's pretty active. It's fairly active. I don't think that Constantine is the one who's actually maintaining it that much anymore, because he has gone on to do other things other than just tweeting all the time. But Sinatra is still pretty active. It's stable is the thing. So it doesn't need a lot of, like, other than maintenance things to keep up with the versions of Ruby. It doesn't need a whole lot of twisting and turning. It does exactly what Blake and Constantine wanted it to do. So it's in good shape. So, I mean, active is a tough question to answer, but I'm sure if you hop on GitHub, you can see that there's still contributions and issues and stuff.
You know, some of the like performance metrics I've seen, you know, I'm not completely plugged into this in a serious way, but just about the performance of Phoenix makes me think, oh, why am I not using Phoenix? Do you have any color, or, you know, can you add perspective to that?
Not necessarily. Like, it's tough because I started using Elixir and Phoenix. Like when Phoenix first came out, I said, okay, so here's a use case for Elixir. And I messed around with it a bit, actually through a couple of conferences involving Elixir to see if I get even more into it. But it never took off for me. So I'm not seeing, other than the folks at Weed Maps who use it heavily. And I'm talking about, they use Elixir and Phoenix heavily, not that they use Weed heavily, which they also do, but that's a whole other thing. But they, you know, they want to use it because it actually does a lot of good things for like mobile apps, or like porting over to mobile apps, where you can kind of mix it up with a little bit of React.js and it works great. But I've never, other than Weed Maps, I don't know of any place that's using like large scale Phoenix apps. That said, again, like it wouldn't be hard to get into and try it out for like a simple, like if you followed along with a like Ruby on Rails, like build a blog in 15 minutes kind of thing, you could probably do something very similar with Elixir and Phoenix. But I don't specifically know what their example apps are.
Okay. Someone post, Dimitri post, that's interesting. Data
That
bus.
is awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, millions of requests a day was good for that use case. Should have written down my questions. I have so many that are flowing through. You know, one of the things that you mentioned it, and I'll give, maybe I should pause and give more people a chance to speak up, but just let me say this briefly. You know, you mentioned it somewhere at the beginning of your talk about some of the kind of road blocking maybe the DHH puts up. You hear that a lot in social media. I mean, one of the things that I think tears down any great ecosystem, or possibly great ecosystem, is just, you know, like you said, people need to contribute, make it better, right? So is there a way that we as a, you know, community, since obviously you've been involved in it for a while, that we can, you know, remove some of those roadblocks, whatever those impediments are that people keep talking about in social media? Is there something, you know, how do we change that?
I think, and this goes back to a concept of I've held dear ever since I went to my first conference. We've got to talk about it. I think that the adversarial way that people deal with things isn't great. And the let's fight it all out on Twitter thing, that, I mean, that was a part of the Ruby community very early on, and it was an embarrassment then. It's an embarrassment now. The problem is, one of the big problems is, to me, is that like David has to shut the fuck up. He's got to, like, he's just got to stop. Like he's kind of, yeah, I mean, like Nico, yeah, how do you fix tribalism? I don't know. If I had that answer, I would, you know, I'd be a genius. But like, yeah, I mean, like the key thing is, like, we have to talk about, like, why did people really feel the need to take down that Web3 track at RailsConf, when the entire impetus behind it was Kerry Miller just kind of wanted to see what people were thinking about it, trying to want to get a feel for what was going on, like completely innocent, you know, reason for going into the thing. And she got bombarded by people, you know, kind of dogpiled by people because, like, we don't want Web3 here. It's like, well, how much do you really know about Web3? How much are you willing to learn about it? Like, if you don't explore it at all, it goes back. It's like back in the day when I first started, it was like, I do Ruby. I hate PHP. Screw PHP. Their community's awful. And, but, you know, you go
Ford,
to a PHP,
Chrysler.
yeah, exactly. You know, like, oh, I hate Pepsi. I love Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola for life. Oh my God. Like, it's stupid. It's really ridiculous. Like, what we have to ask ourselves are the things we building helping people? I've said this a lot. I say it in job interviews. I say it in talks. I've said it on podcasts. Technology is great and whatever, Like, technology has always been good. But the point of technology is to get humans to a better place, to help us do something, whether that's figuring out how to put a stick in a hole to get ants out so we can eat the ants, or building a social media network so people who are displaced feel like they have a place to go to talk about their problems. Whatever the technology is, the goal should be to make human lives better. And the technology we build in the meantime, if it's meaningless, then it's meaningless. We need to think about helping people. We need to think about building better technology. The only way to do that is to communicate. How do I know that the thing that I'm building is actually helping the communities that I'm working with? And that's something I've focused on my whole career. I have an app in beta it's called Call of Conduct. And the idea is when you have a meetup, people might violate your code of conduct. How are you ever going to know? And that's all it is. Simple, non-confrontational way to report code of conduct violations. But when I started researching, I realized nobody had built such a thing, because everybody is too busy worrying about, can they get venture capital? Can they, get a big payout because they're building the new data lake ETL solution for bringing Postgres and MySQL together under one roof? Who the hell cares about that? General people don't. And I think the point I'm getting to here, Richard, is I think sometimes, and I'm going to use something that's going to be slightly vulgar, sometimes technology, we are so up our own asses that we don't realize that we're no longer solving problems. Let's look at the problems. Let's look at how they solve. And the only way to do that is communicating with each other. It's been the way every human problem has been solved throughout history.
No argument.
All right. End rant. Sorry, I went a little bit off.
No, it's good. I mean, very enjoyable to me. Anyone else want to throw in some thoughts for PJ?
Will the people who are not in the Ruby community know that in 2008 about you mentioned it, PJ, the Yehuda cats, and because I always found that, I mean, I don't know how many people know. I might tell it wrong if you allow me, but just Yehuda famously forked Rails, and I forget what it was the basis of it. He said Rails does the wrong thing. And I was sort of entering Ruby at the time, and I remember thinking, this is like a giant fight. And then the next year, they made up, and it was nice.
Rails 3.
Right, and then they merged MERB into Rails 3, so it was nice.
And yeah, that was the whole battle there.
It's not going to be there with all these other things.
Yeah, the whole battle there was over, what do we want Rails to be? Do we want it to be more Ruby-like? Do you want it to be more of a web-focused framework? And I mean, it's kind of like watching mom and dad fight, because it was Yehuda Katz and David, and like these are the people that we had pedestalized, which maybe we should not have done that. But watching them go at it, and like it was tough. I mean, even so, I live here in Buffalo, which is by far not a tech mecca of any kind. We're secret about the fact that we even have a tech scene here. That's why I'm in my basement. No one needs to know. But like, I remember we would have our little Western New York Ruby meetup, the Western New York Ruby Brigade, and Wade Seguin would come and talk about MERB. And Kevin Baird, who wrote Ruby by Example, would talk about why Rails is the better option. And it's like, seriously, our meetup group was 25 people, and we've got these two guys that are ready to throw down about a web framework on stage. And I think that eventually Yehuda and David both realized the idea is, can we answer the question, are we helping people? What will help most? Unfortunately, because David won, and I'm getting into super politics here, but I think because David won, that inflated his ego a bit. It's also the way that he was treated outside of the Ruby community that made a huge difference. People acted like he was an Adonis. He was a brilliant Adonis, and they just praised him constantly. That there's no one's not going to react to that. No one's not. If someone treats you like a rock star, eventually you're going to believe you're a rock star.
Yeah, ego can be an enemy, and I think that we see some color of that in the real world right now. I like this thought that Andre put in the text. Predictions: Shopify or GitHub become corporate sponsors, driving for their evolution and direction of Rails in the future. I feel like that is definitely something that's missing, is bigger corporate sponsorship to sort of maybe diminish other voices there. But I don't know. What do you feel about that? Do you think that helps? What
I
we're
think
talking about
it
in
does,
terms of the
because I
Rails
mean, if you look at, yeah, if you look at the fact that like Heroku still to this day, Salesforce now, but whatever, still finances most of the Ruby core team. Mats is on their payroll, Koichi's on their payroll, and their whole job is just to work on Ruby, which is awesome. I know that at one point in time, and here's some inside baseball. So I used to work at Engine Yard. The younger folks in the room might not know what that is, but it was like Heroku, but like you had to pay a lot of money. Also, we threw great parties, and we had awesome stickers and the most amazing t-shirts ever designed, but also as a platform as a service for deploying Ruby on Rails applications. We wanted to build that ecosystem. We hired Andre Arco, pre-bundler, because he was working on Rails. We hired Yehuda. We hired Yehuda's brother, Avraham, who some of you may know because he was a big Ruby name in the New York area. We hired Evan Phoenix and Abby. We had all these people working at Engine Yard, and they were also working on Rails, but also working on Maglev and Sprout Core and Bundler and all of these cool things that the ecosystem really deserved. And it was a great relationship, because here we were paying them to do these things that our customers then turned around and said, oh my God, thank you so much for doing those things. That's why we want to use you. Shopify and GitHub, if they join in and they say, listen, we're just going to like hire everyone who isn't DHH and add them to the stack, that'd be great. But some of the people who are actually on the Rails core team already work at GitHub and Shopify. And you have that one big blocker. It's a company called Basecamp, purveyors of many different forms of email. And they, like, David's never going to give that up. They're always going to have the biggest share, the lion's share, and the biggest say in the room to decide exactly what happens with Rails. So like, Andre, I love the prediction, and I really wish it would happen. I really totally am for it. But I don't think that's going to occur until David actually says, I'm stepping away from Rails.
So when the last big round of controversy, that happened at Basecamp, I was following some of that, which I'm sure many people were, and there was, all that serious discussion about, who are the core contributors of Rails, and I don't recall, but I'd be interested to ask you this question, like, of those, and the list was published because people were trying to argue the other side that, hey, it's not as influenced by the aforementioned as people are perhaps suggesting. Do you know the distribution of companies represented by the core contributors?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I do not. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I'd say, yeah, because there are only 5 core contributors, but that group is much larger. Yeah. But I mean, it's still, for lack of a better term, it's David's baby. He made it. It's kind of like, we're talking a little bit about, I founded the company DevRel. I'm always going to be associated with this company because I founded it. Even if I walk away, even if somebody pays me. We had this issue at Engine Yard. Engine Yard was founded by Tom Mornini. Tom left in 2011. He was for 5 years still considered the guy who worked at Engine Yard, the guy who founded Engine Yard. So I think it's the same thing. Like, no matter what, even though David contributes very little code to the actual code base in comparison to the other core contributors, he still has ultimate control. And he could drop that hammer if he wants. And that became very clear during that controversy, that he could, not pull the plug on Rails, but he could block everybody else out if he wanted to.
If you,
and there's,
sorry, but if you,
no, go ahead.
I would say not even from back then, but if you look at his most recent announcement of not being the keynote,
yes,
which is, he put that out on Hey, the blog.
Right,
because
his own company's blog.
Yeah, his own company's blog. And if you read it, it's an insight into
sprawling 7,000 words.
Oh my gosh, it's so long. it is an insight into who he is and the power that he still believes he has and controls. Is that all of this was his work of all these cool things that came, which means he developed a lot of really cool stuff in a year by himself, is what I heard when I read that. And then when he got all the way through saying how great he was, then he said, how come these people can't give me any respect? Is what I read from that.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing that I found most interesting about all of this is this would not be the first time he did in Keynote RailsConf.
Good to
I
know.
specifically remember, I shouldn't have said the word specifically. I want to say 2017, maybe 2016. He was too busy with Le Mans and driving his race car. So he just sent like a 2-minute video like, hey, everybody have a great RailsConf. He did not keynote that year. So him being a keynote it's an honorarium. It's a nod. It's not something that's written in stone.
Can I ask a question? Is the Rails conference online again?
Oh no. So I actually just looked at this today because I had to book a hotel. I don't know if I'm speaking there yet, but I am going with one of my clients. It is in Portland, Oregon. It is at the convention center. There is going to be a RailsConf home edition. I don't know what that looks like yet because I don't work for Ruby Central. But there will be some sort of online component if you are not able or not comfortable with going to a large scale in-person conference, which I totally understand.
Maybe DHH will sit inside and pout.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's that's a tradition for RailsConf. But I should stop. David's not a horrible person. He is a misguided person. I'll leave it at that. He's not, he doesn't eat babies. But he's a little too full of himself. He's got an ego, and that's partially not his fault. A lot of it's been given to him. But yeah, I will say this about RailsConf. I will be there. I mentioned that I will be there. I'm excited about it. They are expecting everyone who's coming to be fully vaccinated and to wear a face mask at all times indoors. I will also toss out there that since I will be there physically and in person, I have no specific plans yet, but Ruby Karaoke will be returning. For those of you who don't know, Ruby Karaoke is a tradition that started at a very small conference in France in 2013, where Terrence Lee from the Ruby core team, who works at Heroku, and I decided the best thing that we could do to break down the barrier between speakers and attendees is to go to karaoke, which is the dumbest thing that you could possibly do, because you know what? Nobody does karaoke well. It doesn't work out for anyone. It's embarrassing for everyone. And that's why it's great. We haven't been able to do this in like 4 years. So Ruby Karaoke will happen in Portland. You have my word.
Sounds like a great time.
It's something like that.
I know that we started early and you're being very generous with your time. I just want to throw one other question out to you, if I may. One of the things that really, I think I have developed a very deep affection for Rails, which I guess a lot of people that come to this meetup share. And one of the coolest things about it is the way you can plug the architecture, with engines and things like that. And then if you look at like ngems, even, just to augment the infrastructure. So for example, like, I think it's, async is now been invited by Matt to be part of the Ruby core, which would be, for, I think, a great example of how you can affect an amazing change into the ecosystem by just writing a gem. And I wondered, maybe if you could speak to look at Devise. I mean, I think that's an engine, right? The way Devise is implemented, it just plugs right into the rack. Yeah. So I mean, it's like stuff like that. And I mean, people are now talking about, replacing Devise by something, that's native. But just in keeping with sort of the theme of your talk about all these different, get involved, make things better. That seems like another way to do it. I don't know how often we talk about that, as opposed to being like a contributor or trying to get in, in good graces to be a core contributor or something like that. Just create an awesome gem or create an awesome engine or something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people start small. Don't think about, creating the next RBM or RVM. Think about creating a little thing that like, does a simple async calendar thing. Something that helps, some of the greatest gems of all time are some of the like smallest things. I loved back in the day when Paperclip came out and you could easily add attachments to your Rails app. It was like, oh my God, this is the greatest thing. It's like 17 lines of code. So start small, scratch an itch. But yeah, think about like, the next thing you might be changing the world. I know that Andre never thought that Bundler was going to be as big as it was. And in my mind, in my personal opinion, Bundler is like the quintessential package manager. It blows NPM and other things out of the water. And it's what a lot of those things were based on, and they've never captured that amazing thing that he captured.
I just want to, I know we're probably closing to the end. I should have, before we started the talk, I think mentioned this. I just posted in the chat, what's going on in Ukraine. I know everyone knows about it. This LinkedIn article gives folks, just to bring in awareness if people, want to get involved in that. And there seem to be a lot of opportunities to do that. Really rough things that are happening there. I just have so much enjoyed hearing you speak, PJ. Who else has a question for PJ?
Yeah, the trick is never getting me to start talking. It's always getting me to stop talking.
Hi there. I have okay. I got a phone call and I think I saw your entire presentation, but I missed like 4 minutes of it. Are there things that are languages? Okay. Is there anything that you would think of like that Rails you think is like not great at this and this other thing is great at it? Do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I think the one thing that Rails is not great at, it's being able to ignore parts of Rails. And that's why things like Sinatra and Padrino are so much better at, making small scale application. Rails, you can't make a small scale application in Rails. It's got too much overhead. So like things like Sinatra, Padrino are much better at keeping the scale down, keeping it minimal, focusing on the small bits. It's like, it's kind of like, oh, I built a blog. Well, I better deploy it with Kubernetes because that's what everybody does. It's like you made a blog. You do not need Kubernetes for that. Kubernetes is the Rails of the infrastructure world. It's too much for a lot of people. You don't need it. I should preface that with, in my opinion. I'm not going to say my humble opinion because that's a lie.
PJ, I'm curious to know a little bit more about your business, like DevRel as a service.
Sure.
Especially there's a lot of talk of Web3. So many people are needing that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And people are always asking me about it. It's basically what I do too.
Yeah.
I'm really curious, like how that works. I've never heard of a DevRel consultancy before.
Yeah, well, because I'm the only one. No, I'm not actually the only one. When I started in 2017, we were the only. It was a crazy idea. It was like, I'm going to save up some money and then I'm going to start a business and hope that I don't go broke. This is how great companies are founded, everyone. But the idea was, there's a lot, and Web3 is a great example. There's a lot of people in tech who would love to reach out to specific communities, whether it be Web3, NFTs, crypto people, security, DevOps, different programming languages. It doesn't really matter what it is. There's a community you need to be involved with in some way, probably filled with developers. How do you do that? So we said we would go to these people who are pre-seed, no VC, bootstrapped, 7 people sitting in a small WeWork somewhere, and they want to get involved with the Python community. And we would say, hey, we'll help write content. We'll help you with event strategy. We'll teach you how to be a speaker. Whatever you need, we'll provide that to you as a service. You pull it off our list of stuff that we do a la carte, and we'll help you out and do it. And shockingly, it worked. We've been really successful. I have a lot of fun doing what we do, but a lot of it started with, going to my friends. The first person that I hit up was Paul Campbell, who runs Tito. And if you don't know, Tito's like this ticket selling app for your organization, for your conferences, for your events, written completely in Rails originally. It's now a little bit dirtier than that, but like he just wanted to do something for great communities and he built that. So I went out and said, hey, you don't have, how do you get people to sign up? He's like, well, traditional sales doesn't work. And I was like, well, let's try DevRel. And that's how we kicked it off. Worked with the folks at Magma Rails, the folks at Michelada down in Mexico. Used to throw one of the bangingest Rails confs, Ruby and Rails related conferences ever. And they were just like, hey, we need some help, pointing out the fact that we exist here. And that's really what it grew out of, focusing on small startups and making sure that we could deliver content, whether that be podcasts, blog posts, documentation, case studies, whatever, speaking events, doing events, manning your, staffing your booth. Don't want to genderize the booth work. But like all of that stuff was like super key to what people need to do. They just don't have the bandwidth or usually the money to pay someone to do it full time. That's where we kind of fill the gap.
That's cool. Thanks. I just
Really
want to
It's
get the context of
ridiculous.
who we're talking to.
It's ridiculously fun. Ridiculously fun.
Yeah, for those of you who are outgoing, like becoming a field staff engineer or developer evangelist or, DevRel teams, it's I was surprised. I kind of ended up in it, but it is absolutely a kick. It's been the best time of my career too.
It is, yeah. I mean, I told Andrew, we were talking a little bit before the meetup started. And I actually got into DevRel completely by accident. I was tricked by Corey Haynes. He made me do, he didn't make me do. He signed me up to do a lightning talk at Steel City Ruby that I was not prepared to do. And I had never spoken publicly before in my life. But he and Jim Wyrick influenced me to do it. And it was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. And one thing I will say on the topic of doing DevRel and speaking in front of people, even at this meetup, it's not as hard as you think it is, and everyone wants you to succeed. So keep that in mind. No one wants to see you mess things up. No one wants to see you fail. Everyone wants to see you succeed, so they're going to be there supporting you. So think about doing like a lightning talk sometime, or just like take 5 minutes, think about something you're passionate about, and write up a talk. Give it a shot.
There seem to be so many opportunities in the Ruby Rails community to impact the culture because of the small core committed group of people that, I think come to it. Maybe it's easier to get lost in some of the bigger things out there, but that always seems to strike me, those type of, just like what you just said, and just in general, the opportunities to do that. I guess we are coming close to the end of our regularly scheduled talk. Does anyone else want to have a question for PJ? So if not, typically there's a process here where we go through and talk about people that maybe have jobs, hiring, have open positions, firms who are hiring. Is anyone hiring?
Richard, like real quick, and just to start that right at 7. So, it's the peanut gallery coordinator here. So next month, our event will be a lean coffee. So we did one of those back in December. It was a lot of fun. We will be doing another. So we'll can take a few more turns at kind of the helm of facilitating the process. I'll get that kicked off. So come with your topics, your curiosities. We got a really deep and vulnerable discussion last time. So very exciting. All right, that's it. Richard, back to your regularly scheduled programming.
Really looking forward to that. Thank you. I'm going to end the recording now, I guess, right, Trace?
I think that, you can leave should we leave the hiring stuff on the recording? Why not?
Okay. So you're going to be immortalized if you have an open position. Does anyone like
All right, you talked me out of it. Stop it.
I unmuted myself. I usually cut out the hiring when I edit the recording because it's very temporal. Like the talk is forever, and your questions are forever.